What if I told you one of the most famous cryptid sightings in American history wasn't just another monster story? What if it was more of a warning? In 1966, the small town of Point Pleasant, multiple witnesses reported a towering winged figure with glowing red eyes. They said it chased their car, kept pace with them, and vanished without a trace. Within weeks, the entire country knew its name: Mothman. But this isn't just a story about sightings in the dark, because just over a year later, something happened that would turn this legend into something far more disturbing. A tragedy so real that people still argue to this day. In the fall of 1966, something strange began to move through the stories of a small river town. Point Pleasant sat quietly where the Ohio River bends along the border of West Virginia. It wasn't a large place, and news usually traveled by word of mouth long before it reaches the newspapers. But on the night of November 15th, 1966, 4 young people claimed they saw something none of them could explain. 2 couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallette. They were driving outside town near what locals called the TNT area. The land had once held a World War II munitions plant. By the 1960s, it was mostly abandoned. Empty concrete domes scattered throughout the woods. That's where they said the creature appeared, standing near the road. Linda Scarberry later described it as tall, almost 7 feet, slender but muscular in a way that made it seem almost human. And behind it, wings. White wings. Large enough that they were impossible to mistake. The face was even harder to describe. She said the eyes held her attention in a strange way, almost hypnotic, so much so that she couldn't clearly make out the rest of its features. Then the eyes changed. They began to glow red, not faintly, but bright enough to stand out even in the dark. The couples panicked and drove away, and that should have been the end of it, just another unsettling story from an empty stretch of road. Except the thing followed them. They said the creature rose into the air and chased the car as they sped toward it. It kept pace above the road, screeching, its wings cutting through the night. Only when they reached the city limits of Point Pleasant did it finally disappear. The story reached local police soon after, and the next day it reached the newspaper. On November 16, 1966, the Point Pleasant Register printed a headline that sounded almost confused by what it was reporting. Couples see man-sized bird. Creature. Something. That uncertainty became part of the story almost immediately, because the witnesses themselves couldn't quite agree on what they had seen. Some details sounded like a bird, the wings, the way it flew. Other parts sounded, wrong. Too tall. Too human. Within days, more reports started to appear. A pair of volunteer firemen said they had seen a large bird with red eyes. Others claimed to spot something moving through the trees near the TNT site. People began driving out to the area at night, hoping to see it for themselves. And slowly, almost accidentally, the creature was given a name. At the time, the country was deep in the cultural shadow of the television series Batman. The show was everywhere. Its villains and characters filled comic books, toys, and conversations. Somewhere along the way, local papers started calling the creature Mothman. The name stuck, not because it perfectly matched what people described, but because it was memorable and strange enough to capture the feeling of the reports. Over the next few days, sightings multiplied. Some people described glowing eyes in the darkness. Others simply saw something large moving through the air near the abandoned munition site. And yet, from the very beginning, not everyone believed there was a monster in the woods. George Johnson, the local sheriff, had a far simpler explanation. He suspected witnesses were seeing an unusually large shite poke, a regional nickname for a night heron. Wildlife experts soon suggested something similar. Robert L. Smith told reporters the descriptions closely matched a sandhill crane. A sandhill crane can stand nearly as tall as a person. Its wingspan can reach 7 feet. Around its eyes sits a patch of reddish skin. And cranes sometimes wander off their migration routes. If one had strayed into the area, people unfamiliar with the bird might easily mistake it for something else. Still, not every report fit neatly into that explanation. One local contractor, Newell Partridge, claimed he aimed a flashlight into a nearby field and saw a creature staring back at him. The eyes reflected the beam like bicycle reflectors. That same night, he said his television began emitting strange buzzing sounds, and his German Shepherd, Bandit, vanished. Small details like that began to blur the line between ordinary sightings and something more unsettling. For some residents, the woods outside of town had stopped feeling empty. They felt watched. And as winter approached, the story of the creature from the TNT area began spreading far beyond the town where it started. Soon, the national press picked it up. Within weeks, people across the United States had heard about the strange winged figure said to haunt the outskirts of Point Pleasant. At that moment, it was still just a series of sightings. Unsettling ones, certainly, but nothing more. The darker meaning people would later attach to the legend had not yet happened. That would come the following year, with a bridge, and a disaster that would forever tie the name Mothman to tragedy. For about a year, the sightings continued. Stories drifted through the streets of Point Pleasant. Some people swore they had seen the creature themselves. Others heard it from a neighbor or cousin, or someone who worked late and drove the road near the old TNT site. The descriptions stayed mostly the same. A dark shape, tall, wings wider than a man's height, and often those strange red eyes shining in the dark. But something else began to happen as the reports spread. The story started to change. Not all at once, just little additions here and there. A sense that the creature wasn't simply being seen, it was appearing before something happened. By the time winter returned in 1967, the legend had settled into the background of the town. Still talked about, still whispered about at night, but no longer new. And then, on the evening of December 15th, 1967, something happened that would permanently attach the creature to the history of the town. The Silver Bridge collapsed. The bridge carried traffic across the Ohio River, linking Point Pleasant to the town of Gallipolis in Ohio. That evening it was filled with cars, holiday traffic. Then suddenly the structure failed. In moments the bridge gave way, dropping vehicles and steel into the freezing river below. 46 people died in the disaster. The tragedy shook the region. For the families involved, it was simply a catastrophic accident, a bridge that failed without warning. But in the months and years that followed, something else began forming around this event. People started looking backwards. And when they did, they remembered the strange winged figure that had been reported in the area during the year leading up to the collapse. Gradually, the two stories became connected, the sightings and the disaster. The creature, some claimed, had been a warning. Others said it had been a sign that something terrible was coming. Those ideas spread even further after writers began collecting and retelling the accounts. In 1970, paranormal author Gray Barker helped introduce the creature to a wider audience, presenting the story as something more mysterious than a series of misidentified animals. A few years later, another writer expanded the story even further. In 1975, John Keel published a book titled The Mothman Prophecies. Keel didn't treat the sightings as simple folklore. Instead, he connected them to a much larger set of strange events around Point Pleasant. According to his account, residents had experienced unusual phenomena during the same period as the sightings. Reports of UFOs, visits from unsettling figures described as men in black, and even claims that some people experienced premonitions, visions, or feelings that something terrible was about to happen. Within that framework, the creature itself became something different. Not simply a bird or an animal, but a kind of omen, a presence that appeared shortly before disaster. The idea captured public imagination in a way that original sightings never had. The creature was no longer just something spotted near an abandoned munitions plant. Now it was tied to a tragedy that had taken dozens of lives. Decades later, the story reached an even larger audience. In 2002, The Mothman Prophecies was adapted into a film starring Richard Gere. The movie leaned heavily into the paranormal elements of the legend, presenting the creature as part of a larger mystery surrounding unexplained phenomena and the collapse of the bridge. By then, the name Mothman had become firmly embedded in American folklore. The town where it began eventually embraced this legend. Every year, Point Pleasant hosts an annual Mothman festival, drawing visitors from across the country. People come to hear the stories, visit the TNT area, and see the exhibits dedicated to the strange sightings of 1966. Because, whatever the original cause might have been, the story never completely faded. Reports of the creature occasionally surface in other places as well. In fact, Russian UFO researchers have even claimed that sightings of a similar figure in Moscow appeared shortly before the 1999 Russian apartment bombings. Stories like that only deepen the myth. Yet, underneath the legend, the original events remain the same. A handful of sightings, a frightened drive through the night, and a disaster that happened a year later. Everything else grew around those moments, and the more the story spread, the harder it became to separate what people truly saw from what they later believed they had seen. As the years passed, the story of Mothman kept growing. But the more the legend expanded, the more people began looking back at the original sightings with a different question in mind. Not what did it mean, but what did people actually see? Some explanations were surprisingly simple. Even during the first wave of sightings in 1966, wildlife specialists pointed out that the descriptions sounded very familiar. One of the closest matches was that of the Sandhill Crane. That's a large bird, large enough to stand nearly as tall as a person, and its wingspan can stretch to around 7 feet. And around its eyes sits a patch of reddish skin that, in low light, might easily appear to glow. According to a wildlife biologist at West Virginia University, the bird could have wandered off its normal migration route. If one ended up near Point Pleasant, locals might not have recognized it immediately, especially at night. Another possibility appeared in later research. Some sightings, particularly those that didn't involve glowing eyes, may have been a great blue heron. These birds are tall, long-legged, and surprisingly large when seen up close. In poor lighting, their shape can look very strange. And then, of course, there are the owls. Skeptical investigator Joe Nichols suggested that many sightings could have involved barred owls. When light from a flashlight or car headlight reflects off an owl's eyes, it can create a bright red reflection. The effect is known as red eye, which means those glowing eyes so often described by witnesses may have been nothing more mysterious than reflected light. Not everyone agreed on the exact bird, but the pattern was clear. Large wings, tall silhouette, eyes that caught the light. Birds can create all of those illusions in darkness. There were other pieces of the story that complicated things further, though. After the original sightings were reported in newspapers, the publicity itself began attracting attention. With that attention came something else: hoaxes. At one point, a group of construction workers reportedly tied flashlights to helium balloons and released them into the night sky. From a distance, drifting lights could easily resemble something moving through the air. And for people already expecting to see something strange, the illusion might have been convincing enough. Other sightings were likely shaped by the way stories spread. Folklorist Jan Harold Brunvand examined many of the written accounts that claimed dozens, sometimes even hundreds of people had seen Mothman. But when he looked closer at those claims, the sources were often vague. Children's books, sensationalized retellings, or stories that didn't identify the witnesses directly. Brunvand also noticed something familiar in the structure of those reports themselves. The creature behaved in ways that echoed much older folklore. Stories of strange figures appearing near lonely roads, or creatures startling young couples parked in their cars. In some accounts, Mothman even attacked the roofs of vehicles where teenagers were sitting inside. Those details felt less like biological observation and more like the kind of stories that travel easily through rumor. Even so, the sightings never disappeared completely. Every so often, someone would claim to have captured proof. In 2016, a television station, WCHS-TV, shared a photograph taken by an anonymous driver along Route 2 in Mason County. The image showed a dark shape mid-flight. Some believed it might finally be a picture of the creature itself. Science writer Sharon Hill offered a much calmer interpretation. To her, the photo looks like a bird, possibly an owl, and what appeared to be part of its body might actually be the animal it was carrying, perhaps a frog or a snake. From that perspective, the image required no mystery at all. Just a bird caught in the wrong moment, and viewed through the lens of a story people already knew. There are even limits set by physics. Some researchers pointed out that the creature described by the earliest witnesses, 6 or 7 feet tall, with a wingspan approaching 10 feet, would struggle to fly. The square cube law places constraints on how large flying animals can become. At that size, sustained flight would be extremely difficult, which pushes the explanation further towards misidentification rather than an unknown species. Still, not every detail fits neatly into a single answer. In 1966, a snowy owl was shot in the area by a local resident named Ace Henry, with a wingspan approaching 5 feet. It was described in local newspapers as a giant owl. The bird was later mounted and placed on display inside the Mothman Museum. Some people believe that owl may have been one of the earliest sources of the legend, perhaps the very first strange bird that someone saw and misinterpreted. From there, the story took on a life of its own. Psychologist David A. Gallo later looked at modern Mothman sightings reported online. One website even collected dozens of claims from a single year in Chicago. But the pattern behind those reports told its own story. People weren't being randomly asked whether they had seen the creature. The reports came from individuals who had already chosen to visit a paranormal website, which means they were already more likely to believe in the phenomenon that they were reporting. Expectation can shape perception in very powerful ways. In the end, that may be the quiet truth sitting underneath the legend. Something unusual probably did appear near Point Pleasant in 1966, a bird wandering far from its normal route, seen in darkness, startling a group of witnesses who had no name for what they were looking at. Then the story reached the newspapers, and once a story like that begins to move, it rarely stays the same. New details attach themselves, new interpretations grow. Tragedy gives the legend weight. By the time the tale spreads through the county and the country, the original sighting can be almost impossible to recognize. And yet, the core of it will always remain. A cold November night, 4 people driving down a quiet road near an abandoned wartime facility, and something large lifting into the air behind their car as they raced back toward the lights of town. Not everything out there wants to be found. Not everything out there is meant to be fully understood. But if you're going looking anyway, like, subscribe, and come back for the next story, Through the Foggy Veils.